Hey everyone, welcome to Thriving in Ambiguity, the podcast where we tackle the twists and turns of enterprise and public sector IT, ideally without losing our minds. I'm your host, Steve Mancini, and I'm thrilled you've joined us today for a conversation about technology transformation, leadership, and everything in between. Today, I'm joined by someone who's seen it all in the tech world. My guest is Mac Avancena, a seasoned executive with over 25 years of hands-on experience in technology delivery, operations, and innovation. He's tackled massive transformations in both the private and public sector, leading everything from big analytics initiatives to digital transformation for major organizations. Mac has an MBA from Northeastern University plus certifications in Six Sigma, PMP, and ITIL. You name it, he's got it. He's currently a GreenLake strategy executive and former vice president at HPE, focusing on GreenLake as a service solutions. And previously, Mac served as a chief information technology officer for one of the largest counties in California, overseeing multi-million-dollar IT initiatives and leading high-performance teams. Mac's all about using data, analytics, and proven methodologies to solve business problems and drive outcomes. I'm super excited to dive into Mac's insights on modernization, the future of the workforce, and how AI is reshaping the public sector. Mac, welcome to Thriving in Ambiguity.
Thank you so much. I'm super pumped to be here, Steve. This is a cool setup you have.
Mac, you and I only met a few weeks ago, but I could immediately sense we shared the same passion for tackling big challenges in state government. I knew right away then that I had to have you on the show so we could dig into some of these topics together. For folks who don't know you yet, can you tell them a little bit about your passion to solve government tech problems and maybe a little bit of why you think it's crucial these days?
Steve, I spent 17 years at a media and entertainment conglomerate, a few years in aerospace. And those organizations had a huge history in process rigor and disciplined decision-making. So when I became the CIO of this California county, I fully believed that we're all solving the same business problems. And that the alert for me was how that strategy, from my experience, running worldwide engineering operations, data and analytics for various organizations, how that strategy would impact our local economy and our local community for that matter. In fact, that was a plus for the board of supervisors because I didn't have any formal government background. And so with my career spanning all over the private sector, and that was kind of like my catalyst to really pivot, do something different, be bold, and do things in a way that possibly it hadn't been done before with the outcomes that I had in mind as a private sector guy.
The first thing I want to really dig into is really around leadership and modernization. Now, you just mentioned how you've been part of multiple large-scale digital transformations, both in public and private sectors. But when you're dealing with legacy infrastructure and the demand for digital everything, how do you strike the right balance between delivering immediate results and building a solid foundation for the long haul?
Solid foundation for the long haul. Well, let's define what long haul means first, right, Steve? How do you know where you want to go if you haven't measured where you've been? The old adage of you don't manage what you don't measure. It starts with understanding your environment and applying rigor around your vulnerabilities and blind spots. Alignment with vendors and partners, I think, are crucial as a CIO, as you wouldn't, as a CIO, expect to be knowledgeable in everything technology, right? The irony, Steve, is that today's CIO manages a level of complexity technically and now politically more than any other time, right, in our history. And so a CIO is multifaceted, touches every part of the business. So alignment to strategic partners can help formulate that North Star strategy, if you will, and then that becomes the catalyst for detailed conversations with business and finance leaders. So that's how I think you establish the groundwork for long-term modernization is measurement. Modernization, Steve, is a tough journey. The groundwork, political capital. Political capital. How do you get to political capital? As someone that was coming from the outside, going into a government organization, it starts with that vision. that prioritizes a reasonable phased approach. Let's face it, people are afraid of change, right? They get
No.
uncomfortable. And so, in any capacity where you're a tip of the spear for change, it's nice to have people along the journey with you, right? To have those people along for the journey. A CIO role is already a lonely place to be. The buck stops with the CIO, right? So, in other words, Steve, it takes a village. Hybrid is the connective tissue that integrates cloud, automation, self service, and now AI while bridging legacy systems. So, how do you balance legacy infrastructure, demand for digital everything? The underlying foundational kind of tenet behind that is hybrid. So, don't underestimate your business relationships, invest heavily in those. I used to tell my staff, Steve, that if I was in my office more than 50% of the time, I wasn't doing my job. Although I was a CIO, my job effectively was to ensure that I was helping transform the culture of thought leadership, which meant building bridges of trust and credibility with all the businesses I supported. Technology, Steve, is a means to an end. I think we could agree with that. What shapes and informs technology decisions are business inputs. We can't lead with solutions unless our assumptions are 100% accurate. Build the necessary political capital so that the business sees you as an advisor and trusts your inputs and how you're going to be able to solve their business process.
I think you mentioned a couple things there that I think are hugely important. For one, as we talked the other day, one of the big challenges and the things I learned early in my career, and you mentioned it, is communication of change. Sometimes I would think of things through my lens where I was okay with the change because I saw I knew where the outcome was going to be and I knew how it was going to benefit the business. But I had to really understand that, hey, the people that are going to feel this change the most, they don't necessarily see that vision. So you got to be extra clear in making sure that they completely understand why. Otherwise, they're going to push back. So it's going back to that vision, making sure that they see that vision. So it makes all the difference in the world. So I just really wanted to point that out.
Yeah, let me just kind of expand on that thought. You would ask the question around the immediate results or something to that effect. So, delivering immediate results and laying the foundation, make sure you agree to the business problems at hand first. And what I mean by that, it's a relationship that you as a technology leader has with the financial officers of your organization, with the business, the stakeholders of your organizations. That way you're able to marshal that political support needed to execute on that vision, right?
Mhm.
Call me biased, but in my experience, it's been if you're not aligned to defining the right business problem with your financial, operational, and business leaders, then your project is subject to fail, or I'll be provocative, Steve, and say it will fail. If you don't have that alignment, the three, legs of the stool between IT, finance, and the business or the operational leaders, then your project will fail.
No, it's a good point. And I like how you said you almost have to make sure that they see the problem as well, because if they don't actually believe it's a problem, then you're not going to garner their support.
Correct. That's the underlying root cause to the issues at hand, right? Is people
Mhm.
need to be invested. They need to have skin in the game. And if you're not communicating and reaching out to them in a way where they feel comfortable and they understand what pains you're trying to surface to the table, then they're not going to back you up. They're not going to be part of your journey.
Yeah, no, I love that story. I love what you're talking about there because I've seen it too in just some of my interactions with some state government customers. I've seen where they really struggle to communicate the vision. I think sometimes people get caught up. Maybe they build some great infrastructure and it really works well and it's secure, but they're working with different agencies, right? And then it's almost like what I saw sometimes is they make you fit in that box. It's like, okay, well, you want my help as a central IT leader? You got to fit in my box. And they're like, well, I don't necessarily fit or understand your box because it doesn't necessarily align with what I'm trying to do. And you mentioned, well, that's where those conversations come in. That's where getting out of your office and understanding what they're trying to accomplish is so important. That way you can accommodate them and they know how you're all going to work together.
There's a rule called Kiplin's Law. If you could write the problem down clearly and specifically, then the matter is half solved. The CIO, at least from my experience, where they should be investing is not into technology, but in the alignment of the technology to the business outcome. In other words, Steve, agree first to the what before the why and ultimately the how. I think the why and the how is easy. Getting to agree to the what, that's the art and science of what we do.
Yes, I love that. So the next thing I want to ask you is really around tackling some workforce challenges. One huge challenge today is finding and keeping talent, especially with the different skill sets people need. AI, cybersecurity, data analytics, all of that good stuff. But from your perspective, how can leaders, especially in the public sector, upskill current employees while also attracting next generation of tech-savvy professionals?
So let me walk you through a journey with when I was a CIO at this California county. Let's talk about certifications and the concept of continual learning, right? So I inherited many teams that had varying degrees of operational technical depth. I've always said, Steve, that finance is the language of business. You know, think about that. Finance, as a CIO, I'm the one that's preaching finance is the language of business. If you can't articulate the direct business impact and value to your customers in a way that fosters engagement, again, with the finance and operational leaders, then your idea is vaporware. So, so I believe IT leaders must become that tip of the spear for not just thought and innovation leadership, but financial leadership as well. So that said, finance is the language of business. ITIL is the language of running IT as a business, right? So my first 2 months in this role, I mandated ITIL training, or I set the seed to get ITIL training. So let's be clear what I meant by that. I mandated the classroom-led instruction piece, taking the test, but I didn't mandate passing it. But I wanted my whole staff to go through ITIL. It was at that time ITIL V3. I wanted my whole staff to go through ITIL V3 training. If they took the exam and they passed it, great. That was a huge kudos. And we celebrated that big win, right? But let's be clear, although, if they didn't pass the test and they wanted to retest, I paid for that test as well. Since then, every new hire that came on board to the organization, I provided that same onboarding ITIL experience. And why did I do that? As an IT organization, we all need a common language, a taxonomy that defines business and operational processes in order for us to be in sync. If I, Steve, had to constantly adapt my language to my audience, whether it's business or technical, and I had to do so in a way because I didn't think my own staff didn't understand my vision, then shame on me, right? Instead, I looked at ITIL, I look at certifications and continual learning as an opportunity to elevate everyone so that we're all, in this case, speaking the proven, structured methodology of running IT as a business. That's number one. You'll get a kick out of this one. I gamified training. So I had a deputy CIO express interest in data analytics. And Steve, I'm Power BI certified, I'm Tableau certified. And so I encouraged him to stretch and tackle the learning necessary for that certification track. He was a software developer by education and by experience. So he had to learn database structures, modeling, data cleansing, etc. But what we did, there's a lot of public source data that are out there that you could kind of manipulate and play with. I would get the same data source. He would get the same data source. And we'd spend a day or two tweaking that data source and creating our own visualizations against it. I would show him mine. He would show me his. He would learn from me. I would learn from him. But that served as a success story that inspired others across the team to do similar, right? So it was really a function of, teaching them how to fish. And here's the other thing, Steve, is that securing next generation pipelines requires attracting talent. Let's not sugarcoat that. There's huge headwinds in government, huge, from an economic, from an exposure, from an overall technical roadmap point of view. But here's what we did. We partnered with our local community colleges. And I offered paid summer internships. That was a huge success for us. A, it gave us visibility into the depth of their academic learnings. So
Right.
I had line of sight into what they were learning. B, it infused new thoughts and energy to the team. And C, I had somebody else that was helping promote our mission, because that's effectively what IT and government is, right? That's the foundation is, what's our mission? I think that's the reason why people get into government and government IT is that, they want to impact their local communities and they love the idea of giving back. Couple more things. Um, Rotational programs, stretch assignments. So I came from an environment where I spent 17 years at this media and entertainment conglomerate. And over the course of 17 years, I had 10 jobs. People don't leave companies, they leave bad leaders. So engagement is the key word here, right? You have to provide a compelling value proposition to your staff in a way that supports their growth as well as the business's growth. And I approach that from a very basic point of view, what I call the principle of shared equity. I invest in you, Steve. You invest in us, Steve. Together, we get a lot more than what our individual investments were, right? And then, that not to mention like your traditional kind of exposure to future technology roadmaps and whatnot, conferences. I think oftentimes you can get certifications there with a discount. We made a lot of investments with my staff going to certifications, getting certifications, going to conferences. And it was kind of like a dangling the carrot in front of them. That was their reward, right? For putting in the work. Again, gamifying training, right? And so that training and that exposure to product roadmaps from the OEM level, from the partner level, that's huge. And as a CIO, I think it's important that we make those investments with the OEM so that we could stay relevant and benchmark other similar companies and industries so we have a feel for what they're doing and how we could possibly apply that for our local environments as well. And then the last thing was really interesting. I partnered with Microsoft, right? And we had what's called an IT Innovation Day. And what I did was I had Microsoft and the partner come to our organization for 8 hours. And we had trends around data and analytics, around workplace engagement, around security, right? Around collaboration and communication. And I opened that up to the whole organization, all 40 different departments. I said, here's the structure, here's the schedule. These were talk tracks that were about an hour or so long in length. We had a schedule, we published it. I had the board announce it. I had my boss, the chief officer, announce it and advertise for it. But what we were able to do, Steve, was we brought in all of these different agencies and have them kind of like understand what our roadmap, what our future vision was. And that this wasn't just my idea as a CIO. These were backed by, Microsoft, by all these product people, right? And that was a big win for us because ultimately what it did was it helped lower that guard and that fear of change, particularly when you're trying to promote advanced transformation and digital transformation initiatives.
Okay. Now that's really good. I got a couple things I wrote down here that I want to dig into a little bit. So one was, I love what you said about aligning with different organizations like the community college. So I was in education and as an IT director, I was at a VOTEC. And one of the things we did was the superintendent wanted help aligning the curriculum. So I would go to the different, because I was in Delaware, so we had a lot of banks, we had a lot of different things like that. So I went and met with those leaders and asked them what they needed from a student perspective and what they needed to learn. And so we talked a lot about programming. We talked a lot about the services that they were looking for. I opened up the Cisco Networking Academy so I can build those skills. Really, really cool stuff. But it becomes with those partnerships. So I had great partnerships, and quarterly I would have them all in. I give them a dinner and we'd pick their brain. Hey, what's relevant to you? What do you need students to learn? And then we would modify the curriculum to meet those needs. So it sounds like you were doing the same thing at the community college level, and you were taking it a step further by offering paid internships, which allowed you to bring that talent in, get first look, grab people potentially, I'm guessing at some point, then had that pipeline for talent generation.
Without a doubt. And I think you have to be creative in government. Make no mistake about it. As I've indicated, there are a lot of headwinds there, but ultimately, it's at the end of the day, particularly folks that are early in their career journeys, right? That want to get their foot in the door. I think, being able to partner, for example, at the community college or the local college level is a huge benefit for us because it brings a certain level of continuity to their experience. They're coming into a very rigorous type of environment with their academic studies. They're going into a very rigorous type of environment, working in a local municipality or whatever the case may be. So there's less of a divide there. And then ultimately there's a tremendous amount of structure, good or bad. I think you can use structure in a very good and productive way. There's a tremendous amount of structure, a hierarchy, if you will. And I think that's going to help them understand how to kind of like navigate, not just and sharpen their technical skills, but sharpen their soft skills as well.
Mhm. The other piece that you mentioned, and I don't think people know enough about this, especially maybe at the CIO level. You had mentioned partnerships with companies like HPE, in those relationships, because I don't think people realize how many free resources they have at their disposal. Like someone like yourself, you've been in CIO's shoes, you've been there, and we're able to link you up in certain cases at no charge, and people could bang questions off of you. I think that's something that people don't realize, that we have all this engineering. It's not necessarily just about, hey, buying, buying, buying. What can I sell you? We bring so much more value to helping their business, right?
Yeah, well, let's talk about it. So here I gave you the example of Microsoft with the Innovation Day. Let me
Mhm.
tell you the richness of my relationship with HPE as a customer, right? They sat at my staff meetings. HPE and my partners sat at my staff meetings. I come from a very, very, I mean, almost simplistic kind of perspective of how I run IT as a business. The more I show and expose you to what it is I'm trying to do and why I'm trying to do it, I think the more inclined, the more skin in the game you have in wanting to help me. It's
Yes.
really that simple. Again, that shared equity model, right? And so what was really beneficial for HPE, mind you, Steve, this was pre-COVID, right? But all the things that we were doing around our strategy, around our analysis, around our financial models, all of that stuff, that all was serving a critical purpose for when COVID did happen, COVID did occur, and we were prepared. We were prepared to burst. We were prepared to pivot. We were prepared to adapt to the needs of the business because I was no longer an IT leader having to deal with the world of sourcing when millions, if not billions of people across the world were dealing with the same problems as well, right? So I'm happy to double click on that. I think a couple questions downstream, we'll be able to talk a little more about that. But that's the key. I think, as I've said, I think it becomes a very lonely job to be a CIO. And oftentimes, I think being able to establish a relationship with your partners, a relationship with your OEMs, can help kind of ground you and help really put things in the context and things in the perspective. We were doing things at the county level that other counties across the nation weren't even thinking about doing, and we were successful at it. And so that was motivation for me to hear that from HPE and saying, "Hey, man, what you're doing here hasn't been done before. So let's kind of like dig into it and be a little bold, be a little aspirational, if you will, right? I came from private sector. I made no excuses and qualms about that. And that's what the board of supervisors wanted from me was to think different. And I used that as a catalyst for us to really be tip of the spear for change.
No, I love that. And I do want to tap into that, some of that pandemic conversation, but I got one last follow-up question here, because when it comes to the workforce, as I've been talking, it seems like a common problem that, like, look, you're doing creative things and you're bringing people in, and you're doing creative things around training. But at the end of the day, sometimes there's just not enough people to go around. And so one of the things I've seen people start to talk about is as a service. Now, you used to work in as VP of Green Lake Specialty. which is our as a service model. I feel like some of it is maybe people should be thinking about getting out of the basics of the data center. And correct me if you don't align with this, but getting out of the basics of the data center so you could focus on what's important. And maybe that's application development, maybe that's virtualization, maybe it's whatever.
Yeah.
But the hardware piece of it, I don't know that you need to put as much as you used to. So maybe leveraging as a service might make sense for some customers.
I think for those customers where it doesn't make sense today, I think it's just a matter of time, right? It's like the old security paradigm. It's not a matter of if, but when you get a vulnerability occur. When I think about as a service, first of all, you're thinking about a couple elements here. Let's think about in the traditional IT sense. You know, as a service, by definition, allows you to optimize your operational efficiency because you have automation, you have self-service capabilities, you have very rich reporting capabilities. The idea then is that having that level of instrumentation, you can now, as a technology, as a business leader, discern where you want to focus your energies and your attention on. And so, if you're automating all the runtime activities, the low hanging fruit, if you will, activities, then yeah, Steve, then you are inevitably bound to reduce time spent on operations. And
Mhm.
whatever those may be, but ultimately the end game here is by increasing your political capital with your customer. That's one piece. But there's another element I think of as a service that's really crucial here that people don't often talk about. And that is, what I think around managing two kind of like legs to that, managing the financial risk around that and hedging against future pressure and headwinds. So what as a service does, in my experience, is that it gives you a hedge against the roadmap for future product capability services, right? Gone are the days of, oh, that's an added value benefit you have to pay additionally for. And as a service motion traditionally bundles that, and that's part of your subscription. That's number one. But I think the finance is a language of business moniker here, Steve, is that, as a service gives you a more predictable and consistent model when it comes to your financial investment. Because here's the thing, as a service forces you to think long term, 3, 4, 5 years. Those are generally the sweet spots. Because if you start thinking long term, you start thinking about the growth of change that's happening within your organization. You start thinking about how do you hedge your staff against, future like technical innovations and whatnot. You're looking at potential millions of savings through this rationalization, through this cooperative effort. And so it really becomes a strategy by which you allow your OEM, your partner, into your world of what strategy you're trying to build upon, the culture you're trying to create in your organization, and then helping you build that process and build that mechanism that's going to help support your business for the next 3, 4, 5 years, right?
Mhm.
Big
Yeah.
change from the way it was done in IT. Gone are the days of being able to get by 10, 15% year over year refresh budget, incremental additions. That stopped 10 years ago, right?
For sure. I think everybody realized that. Do more with less now is the kind of the way it is. Let's dig in a little bit of that pandemic information. So, lessons from the pandemic. Let's think through that a little bit. The pandemic forced a lot of agencies
In so doing, that helps you elevate your staff to higher order business, you know, issues.
and companies to really adapt to remote work and digital services almost overnight. How did that experience change the way you approached everything, like hybrid infrastructure? How do you deal with residents? So, like resident portals or AI driven virtual assistants. Where do you think things are going and what came out of that pandemic experience?
So let's talk about COVID. Let's talk about summer of 2020, right? Here's what I learned as a CIO during COVID. Okay. I didn't want to be in the procurement business as an IT leader. And I learned that painfully during COVID. I wanted the kind of like the after action of COVID is, I wanted the flexibility of consumption models because I wanted to avoid course corrections with the board, asking them, every, fiscal year or whatever the case may be of new investment dollars, right? Because If I avoided course corrections with the board, then I avoided the possibility of us, having to admit that, hey, we didn't properly budget for our strategy, or we didn't properly capacity plan for our technology, right? We needed to mature our business processes such that I was serving solutions out of the gate, right? My business was consuming it, and I was holding them accountable because they owned the consumption of the services.
Mhm.
So what COVID taught me is this beauty called rate cards, right? 40 different, agencies within the county. Think about it. You had some agencies that had next generation technology that was heavily funded because they had federal funding, state funding, etc. Then you had oftentimes other agencies that were generally funded, didn't have the benefit of having special funds. And so they were basically living on piecemeal systems. And what COVID taught us is the more we were able to simplify, standardize, and operationalize our environment, the better end user experience we would have, right? That's number one. Number two, when you think about COVID and the amount of information that was just being flooded to us, I had the benefit of already standardizing on my enterprise collaboration and workforce tools. I already had the benefit of standardizing on my enterprise compute storage and networking environment. So it was an opportunity for us to burst. It was the lesson of bursting was it gave me an opportunity to meet with critical departments. We were able to stand up BDI instances because of our Green Lake ecosystem. We had compute storage already on the floor. We were able to turn it on, serve those new BDI instances. We weren't able to do it overnight, but we were able to do it in a matter of days as opposed to weeks or months.
Mhm.
And timing during COVID was crucial, right? The other piece too is from a business point of view, COVID taught me as a CIO to be masterful in storytelling, right? Because it really elevated the role of the CIO to be a public facing function. Let's think about that. Prior to COVID, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Steve, right? Prior to COVID, IT was really thought of as like a backdoor operation. These are guys and girls that just sat in the back room and they were behind their computers 24/7. And that was pretty much the end of it, right?
Yeah.
But no, COVID really elevated and increased our political stake to the success of the organizations that we were a part of, right? So it then gave me an opportunity to become a storyteller in that fusion, that art and science of using visualization and data to analytics that gave me examples of being able to use resident, constituent centric kind of experiences that not only informed them, but provided a clear representation of how government was serving them, underpinned by technology, right? I'll give you a perfect example, Steve. I had one of the directors of animal services come to me one day, and I'll never forget this. Really, really, and you know the story. Really funny guy, and he's like, he went out and said, "Hey, Mac, I don't care what your political affiliation is. Everybody loves puppies and kittens." And I'm like, well, "You're right. Everybody does love puppies and kittens." And I asked him, I said, "So, what bothers you? I mean, why are you doing the role that you're doing? What's your get?" He's like, euthanizations. He's like, our organization is known tragically across the nation as being a high kill shelter. And I said, okay. So what we did was we took the data from their animal services CRM, for lack of a better term.
Mhm.
And I could tell you, I was able to map an XY grid of the amount of euthanizations over time. In this case, it was 6 years, the amount of adoptions over time, also over that 6 year period. And I could show you how his marketing effort and his team's marketing effort was really moving that needle for number one. And more importantly, I could show you the day when there was an intersection between the amount of euthanizations and the amount of adoptions that occurred across the county. And that was a big deal for this animal services director, to the point where we had media, we had news. It was a big celebration because finally he was fulfilling his mission
Mhm.
of being able to change the mindset of our county being a high kill shelter county across the nation. So fundamentally, what we're doing here now as an IT organization is that we are evangelizing our business's voices in a way that's never been done before because we are co-curating, co-creating their stories for them using data and analytics.
Yeah. No, and I think it's great. See, I think once again, it comes back to something you said earlier, and it's about people feeling comfortable with that communication that they had with you. For him to be able to come to you with that challenge and you to be there and say, hey, what are you trying to solve for? What's your issue? Oh, we can actually solve this through data and through technology. Like you said, IT has become a lot more relevant and it's more to the forefront, which it needed to be because especially like I came from a K-12 background and you're exactly right. So many times we were just a cost center. They didn't see necessarily the impact it had to the business until something like COVID happened. And one of my happiest days, now I had left the school district when COVID hit, but my former superintendent reached out to me and she says, Steve, people have been saying how things are possible. They're not running around needing to buy devices like other school districts because we've already done one-to-one. You already implemented Zoom and communication as far as our meetings. So we already had the tool in place. We already knew how to use it. So it was funny because she says, they're reaching out to me, thanking me. And she says, you shouldn't be reaching out to me. You should be reaching out to Steve because he's the one that put all this in place. And it was his forward thinking that allowed that to happen. And once again, it really showed what's possible with IT when you have some good leadership and you have the people that believe in you and trust you and taking that vision and allowing you to put it in place. And that was one of the proudest days of my total career, honestly.
Yeah, and I think the last lesson, that I learned from COVID, and I think is really important in a government type of environment, or at least my experience, right? What is the concept of failing fast. Listen, there was no playbook for what we were doing, Steve.
Yep.
We were thinking on the fly. We were MacGyvering stuff so for those of your audience that are old enough to have watched the MacGyver series, back in the day. That's what we were doing. We were figuring things out. We were figuring things out with our own version of duct tape and a screwdriver, right? And this whole concept of fail fast, which I had the benefit of really embodying in my previous organizations, it was just a natural evolution for a very risk adverse kind of environment to now have to be forced to leaning into the risk because the alternative of doing nothing was catastrophic for our environment, right? This was COVID that we were dealing with, right? And so I think that was the biggest lesson for me and for our organization. I think across the CIO community was being able to lean into doing things differently, accelerating that process, not being so structured and disciplined and orderly because you knew that time mattered and it mattered more so than any other time of your professional experience.
Mhm. For sure. Well said. So I want to continue to dig into the conversation a little bit, and it really falls back into that communication standpoint that you mentioned earlier, but cross-agency collaboration and sharing data. For so many, siloed data is really the enemy of a great user experience. But collaborating and sharing that data across agencies has its own challenges. And depending on the level of government, it can definitely be tricky. I know, like, I've worked with attorney general's offices before, and certain people were allowed to see data, certain people weren't. So that idea of sharing can be challenging. From your perspective and from the idea of privacy and security, what can you share about that?
So let's look at it, I think, there's a couple dimensions to your question, I think. Let's look at it from a macro perspective, right? So high altitude. Let's think about the customer journey for whatever organization you may be part of, whether it's a customer, whether it's a constituent, whether it's a patient, depending on your industry, right?
Mhm.
The customer journey is the get here. The more you understand the inputs and the outputs of that customer journey, the better. And I'll give you kind of like a real basic example in the healthcare industry. So when you look at the healthcare industry, they track patients or in customer journey would look something like this. You track a patient from the point of initial engagement with the doctor to assess a symptom. Then the doctor that helps diagnose it. Then along that supply chain, if you will, they'll monitor that next input of diagnosing, maybe doing an x-ray, And then the next part of that supply chain is to interpret that X-ray, interpret that diagnosis, then the short-term treatment followed by a long-term treatment, etc. There's a series of steps there. It's clearly defined. It's almost like if you were to do a diagram, you could see at step A, step B, step C, step D, etc., what that patient is going through. I think that same rigor needs to apply across agencies, right? Agencies need clear frameworks. Make no mistake, for data ownership, access controls, absolutely. But I think agencies also need a clear awareness around how their services and the outcomes of their services become another agency's input. And that agency's input outcome of services becomes yet another input to yet another agency's services, right? So I'm Six Sigma certified. There's a concept in Six Sigma called SIPOC. It's an acronym for supplier inputs to a process that outputs to a customer, SIPOC, right? All that means to say is, Steve, we're a government agency, and I'll say we're part of public safety. So your attorney general's office, you're the attorney general, and I'm the probation department. Okay. So the attorney general sits at this elevation that walks through that customer journey. The probation department sits at this elevation that walks through a customer journey. What's the middle piece? That is what I mean, and that's how I define cross-agency collaboration data sharing. Notice we're not even talking about data here. We're not talking about unique records and sources of information. I'm just talking strictly at that lens of what is the process that connects the attorney general to the probation, that SIPOC, if you will, right? So again, I'll say it till I'm blue in the face, man. What business problem are you trying to solve? Because, scope creep becomes a real threat in that everyone wants everything now. I think it's easy to boil the ocean, right, Steve? So
Yep.
in the world of counties, my world, for example, think about it as centers of excellence. I have public safety. Public safety, I have the sheriff, DA, probation. Public services, I have health, child support, behavioral health. I have public recreation. I would have parks and libraries that would be classified in that. So I think, a good best practice around cross-agency collaboration, data sharing starts with modeling these centers of excellence around those categories and then exploring different use cases and business problems across those COEs, right? And then what you do then is you're building advisory boards across those COEs so that you could marshal those departments with, and you're emboldening them. They have skin in the game and promoting a shared service and vision for that COE. We could get into the data, but again, the how, the what, it's for me, it's about the what, not the how and the why. I think being able to get the right people together that have affinity to one another, and being able to talk through what that customer journey is, what that patient journey is, what that constituent journey is. I think that's going to be able to be gold in how we can kind of double click into what additional governance and policies and data sharing strategies you're going to need to implement. What do you think?
No, I think that's great. And it makes sense to me. It's like, okay, people maybe have similar challenges or especially data sources. And so, okay, what are they trying to accomplish and get people together to kind of talk through that and then even look long term. Okay. Obviously not looking to solve a short-term problem, but a long-term problem and saying, hey, what are we trying to do? And then trying to build a plan forward of how you're going to address that. That's probably much easier than trying to tackle the whole thing. Maybe it's something that gets there long term, like if we're talking creating some sort of, let's say, modern application where end user has their iPhone, and how can we bring state government to the people? Well, maybe there's a way once you have some of these things built to share additional data, but that's a long-term problem of where to get there. But it starts with something and maybe departmentalizing data and then building from there.
But I think your example is I think it's an important example, but it's a different type of relationship, right? When I think about cross-agency collaboration, I think about two-way relationships, multi kind of functional relationships with my idea around a center of excellence for with public safety, sheriff, DA, probation, public defender, etc. There's a natural need to have information parsed back and forth between those agencies. So there's a level of complexity, I think, that we need to account for. And that's why it's crucial for us to really level set what is it that journey is of the person that we're trying to track. As opposed to, I think what I heard from you was, hey, how do we reach a constituent and have them, have them kind of report on a whole or some type of civic kind of issue? That's a different type of relationship, right? Because that's generally a push or a pull relationship. When I think about, cross-agency collaboration, that's both, right? And there's multiple layers and multiple degrees there. I think, today there's plenty of examples. We do it now at the city level where you open up your app, iPhone, Android enabled. You identify, there's a geosensor there and it tells you, okay, you want to report a pothole, boom. And then you're pushing that information to the people that's now going to be informed to take that recommended action, right, of filling the pothole. Data sharing, absolutely, but that's a different level of data sharing. And I think the utopia here for us, Steve, right, is that cross-agency collaboration where you're now that you have kind of like these interfaces across all of these different agencies, you're now making a more informed decision on how you could now, in fact, affect your policy making and how your policy making could then impact for the benefit of your constituents, your customers.
Mhm. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, sometimes I lose track of the CIO piece of aligning that vision once again to kind of make those connections at the top. I've never really had those type of conversations, never needed to, but that's a great point. Then that's a great thought. Thank you for that. So moving on, I want to talk a little bit about the future and kind of the technology roadmap. And with AI kind of now being the buzz, it's really everywhere. And what's coming down the pipe with quantum computing or privacy regulations, you name it. Everybody's talking about all of these things. It's all coming so fast. How do you create a roadmap that stays flexible but still keeps everyone moving in the same direction? Because this space is getting crazy. And for me, if a customer said, well, what's the expectation for 5 years from now? I have no idea. How are they supposed to plan for that?
So let's be a little controversial here, I think, Steve, right?
Okay.
As a CIO, I don't create tech roadmaps as a CIO. I create strategies as a CIO. My vendors, my OEMs, my VARs, they create the tech roadmaps, right? I think it's really a function of what lane do I feel most comfortable in? And as a CIO, you have to be aspirational in your long-term strategy, without a doubt, right? Shoe high. Steve, be ridiculous, man. Be bold. Because I guarantee you, the more ridiculous and bold you are, it's not a matter of if, but when that vision, that bold vision will likely materialize. Right? It's the concept of being ridiculous and bold, and then using phase-based planning where initiatives are broken down into short-term, medium-term, long-term objectives. And in that way, I think, being bold, you're already future-proofing because you're just thinking boldly, right?
Mhm.
But the tech roadmap piece, I just want to make sure as a CIO, and I struggled with this, right? With my own staff and even with my business, is that they expect me to know everything, and I won't. I can't. I don't have the capability to, but I could hold HPE accountable, right? I could hold HPE accountable by saying, hey, by opening up my kimono and saying, hey, this is what I'm being pressed by the business to solve. What are your thoughts? That's where they help me build that tech roadmap, right? That's number one. Number two, aligning policy and governance to the skills of your business, not to underestimate the importance of government, but it's not like we're solving world hunger here. You know what I mean? We need to be very pragmatic, yes, but practical around what business problems we're trying to solve, right? Because we have to reduce and think about reducing the potential noise of other departments wanting to naturally be curious and wanting to participate. It's almost like you have to think of this like a tiger team and learn against you, learn to fail fast, right?
Right.
So from my perspective, the future proofing, the technology roadmap is really a function of, as a CIO, being very bold and ridiculous, collaborating with your OEMs, your VARs, working in government. We had a bunch of what we call affinity groups. So you have MESAC for municipalities, you have, state, affinity groups, you have California County affinity groups like CSAC, etc. You've got a wealth of private and public partnerships. Again, like I told my staff, if I was in my office more than 50% of the time, then I wasn't doing my job, because really that other 50% was trying to build that, expand that net of being able to collaborate with other entities and other organizations, right? But as you're doing that, Steve, be mindful of highlighting, right, that problem statement across all the teams that you're collaborating with, because they're either going to be directly or indirectly involved, but they're going to be in a position to help contribute to the solution.
Yeah. No, I love it. And I think you nailed it. A lot of it comes into relationships. You can't know it all. So you have to use those relationships to help guide, you create the vision. Okay. And then bringing in those OEMs and say, using their resources and saying, okay, how can we get here? How can we collaborate? And how can you help me solve these problems? And that will help you see the necessary steps to get where you want to go, and be prepared that, hey, some of that's not going to work out and we're going to need to pivot and be agile. And that's okay. Because, hey, if we got to fail fast and do something different and adjust. So then that's great. You know what one customer of mine did? It was a university, and I thought it was really great. Every year they had a partner day, and they brought everybody in, all of the partners. They did a presentation. It was about an hour or so, and they said, here's our challenges. Here's what we're working on this year. So we're not really going to necessarily need to talk about anything else. But if you have some way to help us solve one of these problems,
Yeah.
we'll gladly schedule time with you. And I thought that was a really innovative way. And actually, they even had lunch. The kids made lunch. They had a culinary program or something. They provided food. And I thought it was great because, typically I'm the guy that has to bring a bag of donuts or something like that. And it was a really unique idea. And I haven't seen too many people do that. But once again, leveraging those partnerships and I think is really important, and probably something not enough people do. One of the last things I want to talk about is just next big steps, maybe in the public space. If we're once again kind of building for where we're going and looking ahead, what's the thing you're most excited for in state government? And when we're looking out the next, I don't know if it's AI for you, or if I'm a CIO and I'm thinking about where things are going, what's exciting?
Well, what's exciting for me around government, AI, and kind of like the adoption broadly of technology across government, what's exciting for me is technology is becoming more of a focus on how we're able to bridge and create these stories for our constituents, right? A couple things. It's super exciting for me as a technical guy to know that I have, in the power of my iPhone, the ability to reach out directly to my government elected leaders and tell them what's working and what's not working in a way that can get substantiated and acted upon versus just an opinion in a free-form text box that gets read and gets deleted.
Yeah.
I mean, think about that, right? You get, in a county with a population of 1 million people, for example, and to be able to get that wealth of information, that sentiment, broken down by geographical area or a ward for the board of supervisors, and to talk about, hey, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? And then be able to collate that information and have common themes across your constituents that's backed by data, right? Because you're getting that information and you're synthesizing it, and now you're being able to act upon that. Bro, sign me up. That's super exciting. Super exciting for me, right? Because that to me is in fact reducing the layer of bureaucracy between government and people, right? That's number one. Number two, but here's the challenge behind that is aspirational as that is, and I think it's a very simple kind of use case. Again, how do you know where you want to go if you can't measure where you've been? I think the bigger challenge right now, precluding AI, or that's going to allow AI to give us even a deeper richness of relevant and credible information, is being able to really talk through that customer journey, right? So let me tell you, give you examples. So I partnered with the Department of Public Works, and we were able to extract permits. So different types of permits, like pool permits, roofing permits, home improvement permits, etc. And I was able to show through data and analytics that a permit that was submitted online is, generally speaking, 1.5 times to 2 times faster and fulfilling than a permit that was asked of in person. Why? Right. That's really fascinating, right? I could tell you down to an individual user or an engineer what their yields were for processing permits versus other people. So it gave you instrumentation around how efficient people were in comparison to others in the same role, right? We did something similar for OSHA, Cal OSHA, which is the kind of like safety violations, right? We were able to create dashboards, safety dashboards around time of day, weather conditions, intersections, location services and stuff like that. We had rich body of information to help inform staff of, hey, these are some gotchas, these are some lessons learned that we've seen, when you come across these types of environments. That is to say, Steve, that those are all going to be very valuable inputs into your AI models, because the more relevant, rich information you're giving to your AI, the less risk of noise, measurable, repeatable information, right? And so I think, the next big steps looking ahead, what I see as the biggest opportunities is really around predictive analytics. I think it's really around, giving a DA information around what's going on, where there are hotspots of crime, so that we can start focusing on crime prevention techniques around those areas and using that as kind of like a playbook. Because I still think at the end of the day, particularly when it comes to government, there's a tremendous amount of human intervention and human oversight that's needed, right? Because you still have to work within the context and the framework of the political environment that you're in, right? And not to sound controversial, but it would be nice to have information that you can then use as a playbook to then sequence and kind of instrument, in your own way in order for you to do what you were elected to do, on behalf of your constituents.
Let me just comment on that real quick, because I think you make a great point. And that's one of the things that I'm most excited for, is just being able to have your own AI model based on your data, and just being able to ask normal questions, like you're saying, from your example of safety, being able to ask a question, when is the most incidents happen? And if we're to come back and say, okay, but nighttime, when it's dark, or a specific time of day or at night, but it's when we're having issues. And then you could start asking it additional questions and really kind of have this conversation to really get to the nitty gritty of that data in a way that you don't have to be an expert, right? If you're, let's say, you extend it further, way up the chain, maybe leaders, as far as like your legislation, your representatives, if they're able to ask some common questions about the data and they can really enhance what they're doing and solve some of the problems that they're hearing from constituents, and really then make real good data-driven decisions off
Yes.
of that. So it's super exciting that we're going to have the power to do some really unique things that really, if you were going to do it before, it took a ton of effort.
Without a doubt. And listen, I think data is irrefutable, Steve. Sitting as a CIO in a government capacity, working with elected and non-elected individuals, data is your anchor in a sea of opinions. Everyone's gonna have a competing point of view or expect that, right? And the way you're gonna be able to disarm them is through data. And if as a CIO, if you're not leading with data, then how can you have data-driven decision making if you're not leading with data?
Mhm. No, I love that. All right. Anything else on that point?
Oh, the parting advice between a CIO leading a major transformation.
Okay.
If you don't have any gray hairs, you will. That's the or balding, you will. Or that'll certainly happen. I mean, I'm fortunate, right? You know, I came from an environment where HPE took a keen interest in what we were doing at the county level and wanted to replicate that, you know, nationwide. That's number one. So there is that stickiness in relationships between you as the CIO, the technology leader, and your partners and your suppliers. Don't underestimate that. In fact, I would argue and say you're doing yourself and your team and your organization a disservice if you're not opening up your strategy and your playbooks to them in order for them to help kind of decipher and quite frankly challenge it and make sure that your assumptions are in fact, you know, adequate or if they may be biased, right?
Mhm.
That's the key. Um, I get, you know, think about the concept of shared equity, right? Um, again, if you open that strategy, if you open that playbook, what you're in fact doing is you're giving them an invitation to be invested in your success and to actively participate, right? As I've
Mhm.
told you, it's been my experience being a CIO. It can be a very lonely job. And it's nice to have someone that you kind of lean on or a group of individuals with which you could lean on and kind of keep you honest and keep you credible.
Yep.
We're talking about data. The data is your anchor in the sea of opinions. It's irrefutable. Always lead with it. It takes the emotion away. Data will not take the politics away, but it reduces your liability as a leader, particularly in the government world. The politics is a politics. The board made it very clear to me, Matt, you're not a politician, you're not a bureaucrat. Stick to your lane. And that's exactly what I did, but it took the emotion away, right? Set your goals, define your vision, your problem statements, solicit buy-in, man, adopt a policy of shared equity. And what I mean by that is, Steve, we agree to this. Steve, we want to do this. Never a me, never an I thing. It's always a we thing. And then last but not least, put relationships first. 50%. If you're in your office more than 50% of the time and you're not talking to your customers, you're not talking to your business, if you're not building relationships and partnerships, then I would argue, you know, to reevaluate that and rethink that strategy as to why you may not be.
Oh, that's awesome. Mac, it's been awesome hearing your stories and your insights. I love how you combine the big picture strategic thinking with your operational tactics. So thank you so much for joining me today on the show. For all you CIOs out there, if you want to keep your hair, if that's important to you,
Mine's gone. This
I
story's
mean,
clear. Gone. Okay.
build those relationships and take some of that pressure off of your back because it's important. It's really important.
For sure. I appreciate you, Steve. Thanks so much. I appreciate the service that you're doing, and let's continue to do the things that we do, and then really help elevate everyone's awareness to the kind of like the union between business and technology.
Yep. Now, awesome. Thank you so much again to our listeners. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to subscribe and like, and I love to hear in the comments of your thoughts. Give us a little bit of review. Let Mac know, hey, this was a great point, or maybe you want to challenge Mac. I mean, I think he's open to that. We could
Yeah.
always have him back on the program again and say, hey, Here's what different people felt about what we said. And if you found this valuable, share it to a friend, share it to a colleague, spread the word, because what we're trying to do is really help get the word out there and just try to help educate and get people to understand that there's a lot of challenges, but we're all dealing with the same thing. So how can we help each other? So until next time, keep thriving in ambiguity. I'm Steve Mancini, and I'll talk to you later. Thanks, Mac.
Thank you.